Thank you, Radhika, very much. I think it's already clear from what Charles has said that the sense in which we're using the term secularism is not, as sometimes it's sort of identified with secular humanism or atheism, or, that's sort of one way in which secularism is understood. But the way we are using the term is a political, it's a normative, ethical, and a political perspective which seeks a certain way of arranging the relationship between religion on the one hand and institutions of governance on the other hand. In other words, we're really talking here about political secularism. And what I'm going to do today, here, in the next 15 minutes or so, is to talk about what, in my view, is the internal structure of this perspective, what it is, what it's for, what its point is, why we need it, and so on. So in a sense, I'll be amplifying on some of the points that have been already made by Charles. And I won't do it by defining it or by some abstract characterization of it. What I'll do is speak briefly about some common expectations that all of us today worldwide have as citizens, and a certain common condition that all of us worldwide share. And having described these common expectations and common condition, I will then try and kind of draw out or explicate or outline what my understanding of political secularism is, and which will show quite the relationship between ethics, secularism, and institutions of governance, which is the topic. Okay, and I hope I'm not oversimplifying here, but I will try and, as far as possible, put things in a pretty simple enough manner. Now, all of us, as citizens of any state today, have certain expectations, common expectations, and if we want to translate them into the language of rights, then we can say that we have certain common citizenship rights. These can be sort of classified as what we might call this. I don't think you should overdraw this distinction too much, but we can see them as passive citizenship rights on the one hand and active citizenship rights on the other. By passive, I mean that these rights are realized or are experienced widely to be realized as benefits that come from the state to all of us, right? So these are so what are these passive citizenship rights? Number one, we all believe that we have a right to be protected by the state. We have the right to life and to security, and that should be provided by institutions of governance, right? So in many parts of the world, particularly in our parts of the world, we are always prone to, say, natural disasters like floods and earthquakes and cyclones. We also are, everybody is in some way prone to some kind of violence from other human beings, not everybody, but at least some human beings. So we expect our institutions of governance to safeguard our lives from such natural disasters and from this kind of violence. We want our state officials and the police machinery, for example, to come to our aid. And if we are affected by communal violence or by natural disasters, if we are badly affected by them, we expect some aid to come to us in the form of rehabilitation and so on. So that's something that we all expect our states to do. We also expect the state to provide us with the necessary infrastructure to for livelihood, for say housing, employment, basic health services, education, and so on. And not only do we want the state to give us some kind of basic amenities for sustaining our life and livelihood, but we also wish our state to give us, to protect us, so that we are able to live in a private and intimate sphere where we are able to think and act freely, where we are able to pray freely, we are able to pursue our cultural interests freely. And this expectation or this right is also something that we can understand in two different ways. We can either see as an individual entitlement, as an individual right, the right to privacy and so on and so forth. But we can see it as a right that we have as a community. Many of our, when we think of our religion, we don't always think of religion in terms of individual beliefs. We also think of religion in terms of our practices, our rituals. And the subject of these practices and rituals are not individuals, but our communities. So when we think of the right to this sphere, this private sphere, very often it translates into the right that a community has to practice its own religion, the right a community has to practice its own culture, and so on and so forth. These are kind of cultural and religious rights which belong to the whole community. And we want the state to, in some ways, give us that space to help us pursue these things unhindered, unimpeded, and so on. Now, these are broadly, as I said, one shouldn't make too hard and fast distinction between active and passive here, but these are what we might say passive citizenship rights. But there are also active citizenship rights. The right to vote, for example, is a right that we exercise actively as a citizen. We want to deliberate in public affairs. We all have opinions, not only on what shape to give to our individual lives. We have an opinion on what shape to give to our society, to our collective life. We want to express our opinion freely. We want to affect the decisions which are made to shape the course that society will take in future, and so on. So we want whatever deliberative fora are available to us, we want to participate in them freely, and this is something that, again, we want as citizens, right? And finally, in democratic societies, I mean, these are all there in democratic societies, but in democratic societies, we also want the right to be able to stand for public office. Now, so that's one kind of step in what I wanted to talk about. This is about our common expectations, our common rights, and so on. But then there is the second step that I also wanted to delineate, which is a common condition under which we all live. And that is that we live under condition of deep religious diversity, a point that was already mentioned by Radhika and, of course, by Charles as well. Now, this diversity is of two or three kinds. There is, first of all, this religious diversity, first of all, is diversity of religions, right? So in India, for example, there are not only Hindus, but also Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, Parsis, atheists, and so on. So this is, you might say this is interreligious diversity, right? Then there is also, the second kind of diversity is diversity within religions. So the core beliefs and practices of any religion are interpreted variously by different people, by different groups, so sects formed around them, and so on. And so we have within any religion many different ways, many different versions of the same religion. As is very evident, among Muslims there are Shias, Sunnis, Ahmadiyas. Among Christians, the Protestants, Catholics, the various denominations of Protestants, and so on. Hindus are Shaivites and Vaishnavites. Among the Jains, there are Digambars and Shvetambars, and likewise, I won't say anything about Buddhism because there are many, many such variations to be found within Buddhists as well. So that's another kind of diversity. And finally, there's a third kind of diversity, which not many people speak about, but which is, again, something that needs to be articulated. And that is that whenever these practices, religious practices develop, there are some practices that we believe are part of the mainstream. The more important people in society, the people who are higher up, they participate in those practices, and there are some people who are excluded from these practices. They remain excluded from these practices, and sometimes very silently, in various invisible ways, they develop their own beliefs and practices which are not acknowledged by the mainstream, which are not acknowledged by people who are dominant. They remain unacknowledged, and sometimes when they are acknowledged, they're acknowledged to be inferior than the mainstream, right? So in other words, there's a hierarchy which develops here, and those which remain unacknowledged, as I said, either not, they're either invisible, or when they're visible, there is some inferior status being given to them. Now, this is also a certain kind of diversity. It's you might say, of kind of vertical diversity that exists in society. So there are all these different kinds of diversities. But the last kind of diversity reminds us that whenever diversity exists in any society, there is always the possibility within it, endemic to it, of discrimination, exclusion, marginalization. And I'm just going to use a term to include all these things: degradation, humiliation, and so on. I just call it domination. So in the interreligious sphere, where in the sphere of interreligious diversity, there are prospects of interreligious domination. And in the intra-religious sphere, in the sphere of intra-religious diversity, there are prospects of intra-religious domination. Okay, so we have so let me just link these two together now, these common expectations that we have in conditions of diversity. And I'll talk about my own experience in India, and I'm going to give a few examples. So we find that the police, on some occasions in several parts of India, behaves in such a manner that it protects only one religious community and not the other. Rehabilitation camps after natural disasters or after communal violence are set up, but they're set up only for one community, but not for the other. There is discrimination in housing, there is discrimination in employment, there is discrimination in health provisions, and so on and so forth. So passive citizenship rights are not equally distributed. There are, as I said, discriminations and exclusions there. And voting rights are sometimes denied, effectively denied. Even if people have the right to vote, they may not be able to exercise their vote properly. Everybody is not able to enter on grounds of religion. Some people are discriminated from access to the public domain. And of course, not everybody can freely, even though they may have formally the right to stand for public office, they're not able to stand for public office. And even in strict matters of religion, for example, when we worship, in our exercise of right to worship, the right to take public processions, in the public expression of our religious views, there's some threat, persisting threat, which makes people wary of going public. Some people wary of going public. So diversity in this sense is extremely compromised. And as I said, this can happen between religious groups, but it can also happen within religious groups. There can be inter-religious domination and intra-religious domination. Now, what I want to claim is, and this I believe is a way of redefining political secularism, what I want to claim is that political secularism is a perspective for which institutions of governance should be designed and arranged in such a way that they reduce or minimize both inter- and intra-religious domination. The aim, of course, should be to eliminate it, but even if you cannot eliminate it, the whole thrust of these institutions, this design of institutions of governance should be such that these are minimized and reduced. And this, according to political secularism, can only be done when these institutions of governance or state, and this point was made by Charles, of course, and it's something which all of us have made a number of times. You use the word neutrality, but the point is that they should not be aligned or should not be strongly aligned to any one religion or religious group or any one section of a particular religious group. As far as possible, the state must maintain some kind of a distance. I use the word principled distance from all religions and from all religion-like ideologies or worldviews. And only when they do that, according to political secularism, can the common expectations that we all have as citizens, the common rights that we all think we all share worldwide, these rights can be realized. So here the point is that it's not a question of excluding religion from the domain of the state or from institutions of governance. Exclusion can be understood in a way as in some cases in France, but certainly in Turkey very often, and in China and Russia. The exclusion of religion meant that the state adopts a policy of hostility towards religion, as if it was there only to hinder religion. But that's, of course, something which is ruled out by this model of political secularism. But there's another way in which people can talk about exclusion of religion, which is that religion will exclude itself from the affairs of the state, and the state will exclude itself from the affairs of religion. So there's some kind of mutual exclusion, right? The state takes a policy that will neither help religion nor hinder religion. That's also one other meaning of exclusion, particularly an idealized version of the American, not the French, the idealized version of the American model often talks about it. And this model that I've been trying to advocate, or which I've just outlined, rejects this idea that we should exclude religion. What instead it must do is to have a distance, a principal distance. It should intervene or refrain from intervening in religion. It should intervene positively in religion by helping religion, by giving subsidies to, say, schools run by religious communities. Or it may intervene negatively in religion. I mean, sometimes there are all kinds of very pernicious practices which develop in religions, which are outrageously offensive to and discriminatory towards, say, women, or towards, say, former untouchables in India is a very good example. So the state should have, a democratic state in particular, should have the power and the right to intervene in such practices in order to regulate or indeed ban them. And it not only must it help or hinder religion, but it may have to do it in one religion more than in another. And which strategy it adopts of all these various strategies that exist, which strategies it adopts will vary upon which of them will help reduce, as I said, inter and intra-religious domination. So that's the whole point about political secularism. That's the way in which institutions of governance should be arranged, that these two forms of domination should be minimized. That's in my perspective, what political secularism is, and the need for it arises because, as I said, of the common condition that we all share and the common expectations that we now have. This is not something that could have emerged. This idea could not have emerged in an earlier era where expectations were different, citizenship expectations were different. And in some parts of the world, not in our part of the world, but in certain parts of the world, this need would not have arisen if there wasn't the kind of deep religious diversity that exists now. But once these are there, then the only proper normative response, in my view, should be what I call political secularism in the sense in which I've just outlined it.